You and I are going to dive right into After Effects now, and we're going to take it slow, but the way that I've laid out this course is to really make it practical. So in this lesson, we're going to work our way around After Effects. I'm going to talk through the different panels so that you feel a bit more comfortable. I know how daunting it can be when you open up After Effects for the first time. There's so many buttons and titles and panels that are confusing. But I'm not going to make this course one of those courses where I just sit back and tell you, okay, this button does this button does that, this button does this button does that, because that's not a great way to learn. Throughout this course, you're going to be working on mini projects and then full real-world projects. And throughout that, you're going to be learning different tools, different effects. And so I really encourage you just to work through each of the lessons. They build upon each other. And so by the end of this course, you should feel comfortable working on real-world projects in After Effects. If you come across a button or a panel that you're confused about, feel free to let us know and to post a question in the Q&A tab of the course. Otherwise, we might answer that question later on, so just keep working through. When you open up After Effects for the first time, you'll probably get a pop-up, the Start module, that asks you to start a new project. You can see here that I have a number of projects that I've worked on in the past. Once you've been using After Effects for a while, you'll see all of these projects appear here. First, when we're starting, we're just going to click New Project. And that's going to open up After Effects like this. I'm using the Adobe 2017 version, Creative Cloud version of After Effects. If you go up to After Effects up here in the title menu and you click About After Effects, this is how you can see the version. I'm using version 14.2.1.34. It's the 2017.2 release. When After Effects updates, as they usually do once or twice a year, they add new features. I'll be updating this course. Really though, no matter what version you're using, especially if you're using a Creative Cloud version, your After Effects is going to look very similar. So just click in the middle to get out of that menu. The next thing you want to understand is the layout. One thing to note is your After Effects layout might look a little different than mine right now. And that's because there are different workspaces. If you go up to Window and then Workspace, you'll see that there's different workspaces because there's different panels that you might want to use to do different effects, but you might not necessarily need them open all the time if you're not working on that kind of thing. For example, if I click Motion Tracking, it will bring up this Motion Tracker panel on the right-hand side. But if I'm not doing motion tracking, I might not need that panel open. So to get on the same page, go to Window, Workspace, and then go to Default. This will be the default view that we'll be working through in this lecture and moving on. All right, let's get acquainted with After Effects. In the top left, you have your toolbar and your menus. A lot of the things that we do in After Effects with buttons within the actual program down here can be done through the menus up here. A lot of these options are grayed out right now, and that's because we can't do much without starting an actual project. Below that, we have the toolbar. You don't see all the tools right now until we start a composition in a project, but you'll be using a lot of these different tools in this class, most of them actually, and this is really what we use to create our own effects and animations. On the left-hand side is the project panel. This is your basic documents folder for your project. If you've used Adobe Premiere Pro in the past, it's very similar. This is where you can import media and graphics. You can organize things. You can add, everything from music to Illustrator files. Everything you can organize in your project. And this is also where you'll be creating different compositions, which in After Effects, a composition is basically an individual video that you're working on, an individual graphic, an individual sequence. So if you are accustomed to Adobe Premiere Pro, think of a sequence as the individual video you're working on. In After Effects, it's a composition. The way that these panels sometimes work is that you have the main tab, and then behind this, you have another tab. So here we have the Effects Controls tab. This is where you'll be adjusting a lot of effects once they're applied to your footage. So that's the project window or panel. In the middle, you have your composition. Once we start a new composition, which we'll be doing shortly, you'll see this is where you actually have your project. On the right-hand side, there's a number of panels. Just by clicking on them, you can open them or close them. So we have the effects and presets, preview, audio. These are all things that we'll be looking at in the future. And then down below, you have your timeline. This is how you start creating your actual projects. To take it to the next level and see more of the options, we're going to have to start a new composition, and we're going to do that coming up next. Let's start a new composition. There's multiple ways to do everything in After Effects. Usually there's a button in the interface. There's often a keyboard shortcut, which you can get to if you go to Help and then click on Keyboard Shortcuts. This will take you to the Adobe website, which has shortcuts for both Mac and PC users, which is really helpful. And then lastly, there might be a menu option up here in the top. So if you go to Composition, for example, you'll see the New Composition button, which will also show you the keyboard shortcut. I'm using a Mac, so it's going to be Command N. Or just click this button down here in the project panel. This brings up your composition settings window. Remember, think of this as an individual video or maybe an individual clip that you're working on. You can always rename this later, but for example, I would just call this After Effects 1. You can name it whatever you want. Then you have all of your sequence settings. Under the basic settings, you have different presets. So if you're using a particular type of camera or footage, you would just select this one of these presets. For example, a lot of videos that I create, I'm shooting at 1920 by 1080 pixels. This is what your standard HD footage is. And I shoot at 29.97 frames per second. So I could find one of those presets that matches those settings, such as this one, HD TV 1080 29.97. That changes the width and height to match that. It also changes the frame rate down here, and you can customize this stuff yourself. For example, if you want to create a square graphic, for example, if you're putting on social media like Facebook or Instagram, which likes square graphics, you can just click in the width or the height and type in the pixels that you want. So if we want a square, we can do 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels, and that would work fine. Typically, your pixel aspect ratio should just be left at square. If you run into an issue or if someone wants you to do it differently, you would select these, but for most of the projects you're using, just leave it at square. Next, you have basically your timeline window options. The duration is an important one. This can also be changed later, but this is where you set the duration of your composition, which is different than, again, referring to Premiere Pro, where if you start a new sequence, it can basically be as long as the video you add. You can keep adding clips. It could start out as a minute, but then as you add more clips, it turns into 2 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. With After Effects, you set the duration in the beginning. So if you want a clip or an animation to be 5 seconds long, then you would set it as 5 second long, like it shows here. If you need it to be 10 seconds, you would change this to 10 seconds, for example. This can also be changed later, but it's good to start out with something shorter, like so. Background color, this is the background of the composition. This just depends on how you want it to look while you're editing. This doesn't actually change the background of the video itself. We'll be showing you how to add a background color in a future lesson. This is just, think of it as the transparent background so that you can work in your project. Some people like a white background just to see what that looks like. Typically, I'm just going to leave it as black. When you're happy, just click OK. And now you can see two things happen. One, in our project tab over here, we have this composition. And then down here, our timeline has sort of opened up. And you can adjust your timeline to zoom in and out. You can see now that our timeline goes from 0 seconds to 5 seconds. And then you have the frames in between, 10 frames, 20 frames, then 1 second. To zoom in, you can take this top bar, the time navigator, and zoom in by dragging to the left or right. There's also this little slider at the very bottom for you to drag in and out, and that allows you to zoom in and out. You can also use the plus or minus keys on your keyboard. Just a few more things about your composition panel. Down here at the bottom, you have different ways to adjust the view. On the left, you have this percentage. This will depend on the resolution of your screen. You can zoom in according to a percentage, and this will zoom into your composition at that percentage. So if you just want to set it at a smaller percentage, you can choose like 25%. So this is moving your 100% resolution composition and shrinking it to 25%. If you want it to just match the size of this panel, you can choose fit up to 100%. And now you can adjust the panel size by clicking on the edge and dragging up or down. And this is helpful because oftentimes I'll find myself adjusting the size of these panels so that I have more room in the timeline, for example. And that way, the video or the composition adjusts while I change that panel. The other thing I want to mention right now is this resolution. Right now I have it set for full, and this is the playback resolution, not necessarily the export resolution of your video. And this helps if your computer is a little bit slower. Oftentimes, my After Effects students ask, my computer's running slow, it's lagging, the video plays back choppy. How do I make it play back smoothly? Usually the issue is that you don't have enough memory or RAM processing power in your computer. I recommend at least 16 gigabytes of RAM. On a Mac, you can see that information by clicking the Apple button and clicking About This Mac. You can probably find a similar setting on your PC as well in your computer settings. So here you can see that my memory is 16 gigabytes right here. Even still, when I'm using high resolution footage like 4K footage, I do get a little bit of playback lag. And so to fix that, we can actually decrease the resolution of our playback. This will play back at a lower resolution, so you're seeing a little bit lack of quality, but that's better than having a choppy playback, in my opinion. The last thing I want to talk about right now with this composition panel is this button right here, which is the toggle transparency grid button. So see, if I click that, you get this checkerboard view. When you see the checkerboard, think transparent. So if you actually wanted to export this video right now with transparency, what you would get is just a blank video with nothing. It wouldn't even be a black background. Even though the background of our video is set to black, remember what I talked about in the composition settings, which you can get back to if you go to composition settings, or Command K on your keyboard. See, the background color is black. If I set this at white, for example, click OK and then click OK. If I click the transparency grid button again, it still shows that it's a transparent background. We're going to see how this comes to play when we create graphics like titles and we want to put them onto other videos in the future. But just know that you can click this button to see what in your composition is transparent. That's the basics of starting new compositions. In the next lesson, we're going to be importing graphics into our project panel, and then we're going to be moving on and actually working with our composition and adding new layers. A lot of what we'll be doing in After Effects, we create from scratch right within After Effects. So creating things like titles and motion graphics, you can build most of that right within After Effects. Other times, though, you'll be using After Effects to apply visual effects to video clips, or you'll be using photographs that you created and you'll be adding effects to that. Or maybe you'll even be adding music and sound effects right within After Effects. I typically do that in Adobe Premiere Pro because it's a little bit easier and more efficient for me, but you can still do it in After Effects. To import media into your project to work on, just go to your Finder folder or your Documents folder, and then you can simply drag any asset into your project bin. So for example, if I wanted to bring in this picture of a kangaroo that I shot in Australia, I can just simply drag it and drop it in After Effects. And you can see that when I get that plus green button, it means that I can drop it into my project panel. And then the other ways you can import are just by right-clicking, choose Import, and then choose File. And then you could go to your folders through this. So for example, if I wanted to bring in some music, I can pick this music, click Open. Or I could go up to File, Import, again, Import File. Let's import a video, for example. We'll do this video sample and click Open. Once it's imported, I definitely suggest organizing your footage. I typically create folders or bins for the different types of footage. So for example, I can create a new folder by clicking this new folder button and then call it video, for example. And then I would put all of my video clips in this video folder. Or if I'm working on multiple compositions within the same project, which I'll tend to do, I have many compositions right within one project, I might separate them into different folders. For example, I would typically have a name for these graphics, but I would call this graphic 1. And then within this graphic 1 folder, I would put all the music and all the photos that I used for this graphic. And within this folder, I might even create subfolders for photos, for example, and then put the photos within that folder. I find it is going to help you a lot if you learn to organize your footage. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I think you just kind of have to figure out what works best for you, and it might change depending on the project. But please keep everything organized as you work through your projects. It will just make you a better After Effects user in the long run. How do you actually work with this footage or all of these assets that you're bringing in? Well, you basically add them to your timeline. There's different ways to do that. Let me take this photo, for example, and drag it into my composition. There's two ways to do it. You can drag it right onto your composition window itself or down into the timeline. Now let me show you what happens when I drag it onto the composition. See, it just pops in right there. And you'll notice that this layer has been added to our After Effects timeline down here. And it's been added to this entire sequence or this entire composition from start to finish for all 5 seconds. Now let me take the same photo, again, drag it into the timeline, but you'll see now that as I drag from left to right, there's that little icon that moves left and right in the timeline bar, and this is where it's going to start. So if I want it to start at 1 second, for example, I'll just drop it right there. And now you'll see that this photo starts at 1 second. I can move the current time indicator to the right and see where this one starts. But you'll see that I don't see that photo that I just added down here. And that's because it's beneath this other kangaroo photo. So if I want, I can drag this second kangaroo photo, this layer right here, above the other one by clicking on it over here in the left-hand side of the timeline above our other kangaroo. And you'll see that it actually added it to sort of a different position. This first one, it added to where I dropped it. Let me delete that one more time to show you. So if I want to move, drag it and drop it in over on the right-hand side, I can do that. Now, again, I'm going to move this beneath my other kangaroo layer. And you'll see if I scrub through just by clicking and dragging through this composition, it goes from this photo to that photo. So think of After Effects as layering different media assets on top of each other. Whatever's on top will show. In the next lesson, we'll be using and looking at some of the most important tools up here in the toolbar. I'm going to go ahead and delete these two folders and media assets because that was just for example. So I'm just going to select them in my project panel and then click delete. And now let's go over the basic tools. If you hover over them and just pause for half a second, you'll see the name of the tool pop up with the keyboard shortcut. This first tool that is sort of your standard mouse tool that you'll be using for most things you do in After Effects is just the selection tool. This allows you to click on things, and then once you have different assets, shapes, titles, layers in your composition, it allows you to click on them and move them around. The next is the hand tool, and this actually moves around the composition window itself or the video itself in your composition window. For example, if I set this to 25% and then I take my hand tool, I can actually move this composition around. And this is beneficial if you have something that you want to zoom in on and then you want to move around your composition so that you can see it more clearly. Speaking of zooming, you can zoom in with the zoom tool. So I can zoom in. Now to zoom out, once you have the zoom tool selected, which is keyboard shortcut Z, you can press Option on your keyboard and then click to zoom out. Option on a Mac, and then it will be Alt on a PC for PC users. That's another way, other than using this drop-down menu here, to zoom in and out of your composition. I'm actually going to bring back my kangaroo photo so I can show you kind of more what this looks like and what these other tools do. So I'm going to drop this in on my composition. And I wasn't going to show you all of these things until next lesson, but let me just show you a quick way to zoom in and out of an asset that you've added, or to scale it up or down. If you press S on your keyboard, that brings up the scale property. You have these percentages here. You can just click and drag to the left or right. So you can see I can zoom in and out. It's not necessarily zooming in on my video, it's just scaling up or down the asset that I'm using. So if I want to fill the frame, I'll put it at about 49%. Now you can see more clearly if I zoom in, for example, and let's change the resolution to full so we get the highest quality possible. And then I take my hand tool, which another quick tip is if you just press the space bar on your keyboard, you temporarily get the hand tool. And then when I unpress the space bar, it goes back to the tool that I was using. So for example, if I'm using the selection tool, I can use the space bar to move this around. Let me zoom out really quickly. So let me zoom out to 50%. And then I'll just space bar, hand tool to move this around. With the selection tool, if I click and drag this photo, it's actually moving it around the composition. So if I want it on the right-hand side, I can do that. On the left, up, down, etc. That's different than the hand tool, which is actually moving just the composition window around. Same with the zoom tool. You're not actually zooming in on the video or the media. It's just zooming in on the window, the playback. The next tool is the rotation tool. And so if I click that and then I click on a layer, so I have to have a layer selected, then I click and I drag around, I can rotate this image left or right. Say you do something and you don't like what you did, you can quickly undo by pressing Command Z on your keyboard. We're going to skip the camera tool, which we'll be covering in the 3D section of this course. And then there's the pan behind tool. This is a little bit confusing, so I'm going to try to explain it as clear as possible. But this has to do with the anchor point of each layer. The anchor point is symbolized by this little circle with the lines coming out in sort of a cross section. You see that? It's right there. It's kind of hard to see, I know, but it's right there in the middle of this layer. And what this does is it anchors all of your different properties to this point. So remember when we scaled this photo up and down here with the scale property? So if I zoom in and out, where is it zooming in and out from, or scaling up and down from? It's scaling up and down from that point right there in the center, the anchor point. What if I move this point down to the left, which I can do by clicking on our pan behind tool or the anchor point tool? I can drag this anchor point down to the left. And now if I scale up or down, it scales from that point. See how that works? And so the anchor point is going to really come in handy later on when we're changing how we animate different layers. This will also affect the rotation. So if I go back to the rotation tool, it rotates from that anchor point. In the rest of this lesson, we're just going to go over these three other tools: the rectangle or shape tool, which is also the mask tool, the pen tool, and the text tool or the type tool. These other tools are a little bit advanced, and we'll be going over them in a later lesson of this course. First, the rectangle tool. The rectangle tool, or if you click and hold it down, you can see that there's more options, such as the rounded rectangle tool, the ellipse tool, the polygon tool, or the star tool. This allows you to create shapes. you will be able to create a new shape if you don't have anything selected in your timeline. So what does that mean? If I click on this kangaroo layer, it highlights this layer. You can see that when I click it, it's this sort of bright purple. If I click off of it just down here in the timeline, it sort of becomes a little bit darker. If you have that rectangle tool and then I just click in my composition window and drag, you can see that it creates this rectangle. And I can change the shape and size, and eventually we can change the color as well. And when I do that, this new shape layer appears in our timeline. Okay, let me delete that. Actually, delete that layer. Now I want to show you what happens when I have the kangaroo layer selected. And then I have this rectangle tool selected. And then I try to create a rectangle. What happens is I'm actually creating a mask of this layer that's selected. Cool, right? So if you want to crop or quickly cut out a piece of your photo or any of your media assets, you can do that with this shape tool, or what becomes a mask tool. Let me undo that and say we want to create a circle or an ellipse, as they call it. We can choose that tool and then just drag around our kangaroo's face. I'm going to show you how to create perfect squares in the next lesson. Let me undo that. The next tool is the pen tool. While this is selected, what I can do is just click around and it basically creates a custom shape. So every time you click, it creates a new point, and then you have to complete all of the points in a complete circle for it to actually become that shape. Again, with the kangaroo layer selected, it creates a mask for this kangaroo layer. Let me undo that. Undo. If I click off of the kangaroo, and then I click with the pen tool, and I do the same exact thing, you can see that without the kangaroo selected, it creates an actual shape layer. So you're now learning that these two tools, the pen and then the shape tool, they have two things that they can do. They can either create masks or they can create shapes. Let me delete that one. Lastly, we have our type tool. So with the horizontal type tool, or if we click and hold, you have a vertical type tool. You can select that and then you just click in your composition where you want to add type. Click, it adds that empty text layer down here. And then if we start typing, hello, you can see text. Over on the right hand side, you'll also notice that the character panel popped open. And this is where we have all of our text options. You can change the font, you can change the style, you can change the color. And we're going to be going over more of these options in a future lesson, but feel free to play around with these settings. Now, it won't change anything unless you have your text highlighted with your text tool or your type tool selected. Or if you go back to your selection tool, now that selects all of that text and you can change these settings. So if I want to change it to white text, I can click the text color, which is this window right here. That brings up our color picker. And then I can drag around and change to white, for example. If I want to change the font, I just choose a different font. If I want to change the size via this method, which is different than the scale method that we showed you down here, I can change the text pixels or the font size pixels. Those are the basic tools in After Effects. And as you can see, there's so much in After Effects, and I hope you're learning so far. It may seem like we haven't covered that much, and it's true. There's so much more to cover, and this course has already been, 30, 40 minutes long. So I hope you found it beneficial so far. These lessons are really the basis, the foundation, and as we move forward, we're going to get more into the real world aspects of it. But hopefully this has been helpful. And in the next lesson, we're going to be going over more of these different options in the timeline. Before I move on to the timeline, I promised that I would show you how to create a perfect square or circle. So first, I'm just going to delete these layers by selecting them here in the composition panel and just deleting them. To create a perfect square, take the rectangle tool, and then while you have it selected, just click the shift button. And you can see that as I drag out, I create this square. You can see that it's being created from this upper left corner. What if I want it to be created from the center? Well, let me delete this layer. Now with the same tool selected, if I click and then I hold Shift and then I hold Command, which on a PC would be the control button, you can see that it creates and it grows from the center, from where I clicked. Cool. Now how about a circle? It's basically the same thing. So if you go to your ellipse tool, and then if you click and drag, you'll see that now it's just an oval. But if I hold the Shift button, it's that perfect circle. And remember what we did to create the circle from the center, from where we clicked? We held the Shift button down and the Command button. That's on a Mac. It would be the Control and Shift buttons on a PC. Okay, so now I have this shape. I'll go back to my selection tool and I can move it around my composition. Here's another quick tip. If you want to align it to the center of your composition, say you want it to be perfectly in the center, horizontally and vertically, go to your Align panel just by clicking Align and click Vertical Center Alignment and Horizontal Center Alignment. These buttons right here allow you to adjust where your layer is according to your composition. Now, how do we change the color of our shapes? Well, there's this fill button up here. So with this shape layer selected, I can click the fill color right here and I can now change it. So if I want a light blue circle, I can do that. You also have this stroke option. So right now the stroke, you don't see it because it's set to 0 pixels. But if we want a stroke, which is a little hard to see right here, I set it to 15 pixels. It now has a white stroke. I'm going to turn off the transparency. How do I do that? You might have saw me going over there. Is this button right here. So let me turn off the transparency. So now we have that black background. And this is great because now we can easily see this image in our shape with the stroke. If I want to change the color of the stroke, just click the color next to the stroke. And now I can change it. Maybe I want that sort of red and blue look. Super cool, right? And now you have a red stroke. So those are just some basic things to know about using the shape tool, how to align layers to the center. And now in the next lesson, we're going to be going over more of the options down here in our timeline. Next, let's look at the timeline. So I have that perfect circle that we created in the last lesson. I'm actually going to turn off the stroke just by changing the pixels to 0. And I'm also going to add my kangaroo photo back onto the timeline, just dragging it beneath my circle. Cool. So we already learned how to zoom in and out of our timeline just by dragging this top bar or by zooming in down here. You'll also notice that there's this other work area bar. If I press the space button, it's going to play through all 5 seconds of this composition. And you'll see that After Effects is automatically set up to just repeat, to loop the play. So it's going to continuously keep playing. And that's because in After Effects, often we're creating these little animations and we just want to see it over and over to see how it looks, instead of having to press the play button over and over. What if we were creating some sort of animation at the very beginning of this, and say this is just a basic animation where our circle pops on? Well, how do we do that? We can just drag this shape layer over to the right, and you'll see that now it's off at this time. And then if we drag through, it's on. Now, that's not really an animation. We're going to be covering how to actually animate things in the next section, so coming right up. But now, if I play through this, it's going to pop on right there. Let's make it a little later, at 10 frames, for example. Go back to the start. Okay, play there. Now, it takes a while for it to go through the 5 seconds and then go back to the start again. Say we want to zoom in on this time frame, for example, the first second, more easily. Take your work area bar, and now we can drag this in to 1 second, for example, and you can see that it's highlighted. Now, if I take my time indicator and I move it into this work area, then I press the space bar, you can see that it loops the play just for this area of the workspace, which is super beneficial as you create your more intricate graphics. One other use for this, let me bring back our video clip. So let me bring in this video sample. And then A quick way to create a composition based off the size and settings of your actual media asset is just to drag your media asset into the composition button right here. You'll see that it created this video sample composition, and then down here, it's the right size, so it's the same aspect. It's also the right length. So it's all 2 minutes and 20 seconds of this video, which was a video for another class of mine. Say you have a video clip, but you only want to add graphics to a certain part of it. Say I want to add a title graphic right here between 5 seconds and 15 seconds. Well, I can take my work area bar and I can move this to around 5 seconds. And then I can take the end of it and move it to 15 seconds. And now if I zoom in just with this bar right here, and now I have this set up so that my work area is going from 6 seconds to about 15 seconds. You can see that if I click in the middle of this workspace bar, it moves the whole work area. To move the end in or out, you have to click on the end of the work area and then drag. So that's how you can sort of zoom in and work on a specific part of a clip. What if we want to actually just trim this whole composition to this specific part of the clip? Because as you're working on this project, you might not even need everything that's to the right of this sort of work area. If you go up to composition, then choose trim comp to work area, what happens is it trims it to that work area that we had set up. So now it's just that 6 seconds to 15. Now we can't go ahead and zoom back out from this. You see that now our zoom bar, if we use this, it just allows us to zoom in and out from that 6 seconds to 15 seconds. So that's one thing to note. We can, of course, undo this, or we can go back to composition and our composition settings. And now you'll see that the duration is 9 seconds. Say we want this to go for 10 seconds. If I put in 10 seconds and then click OK, then I zoom out. Okay, here's another thing with your timeline. Look what happened. At the end of this video clip, you'll see that, this video clip actually disappears. You can see that there's this little cut point right here. And that's because in the previous part, we went to composition, trimmed comp to work area. It actually trimmed this media clip or the video clip to the comp area as well. So to extend this, what we can do is just hover over with our mouse over this end of the layer and drag to the right. Now, if we go through and scrub through, this video plays through till the end of our work area. One keyboard shortcut that I like and is really helpful is the command left or right bracket shortcut. For Windows users, it would be control left or right bracket. So if I press command and then I press right bracket with the kangaroo layer selected, it actually moves this layer up. I can choose the command left bracket to move it back down. So this is how you can reorder layers just on your keyboard. All right, that's a lot with the timeline over here on the right, but there's all of these buttons over here on the left. And we'll be going over all of these things in future lessons as they become more applicable. But the things I want you to know are, first, on the very far left is this little eyeball icon. And you have these different columns with these buttons where if you check on or off, it includes that little icon. So to turn off this layer, which is what the eyeball icon is for, you can just press that eyeball for the layer and it makes it basically disappear. It turns it on or off. We don't have any audio in these clips, but we do in the video sample. And that's what this next column is, the audio. And so if you want to turn on or off audio for a specific layer, just turn that audio on or off with that column. Back to our other composition. I'm going to move my time indicator to this point where we have both layers. This next column is to solo layers. And this might be more beneficial or easier to understand if we have more layers. So let me duplicate this shape layer 1. To quickly duplicate a layer, instead of going up to our shape tool and creating another layer, we can select it in our timeline and press Command D or Control D for you Windows users. Or you can also copy and paste by selecting it, pressing Command C, and then Command V. That's Control for PC users. So from now on, if I ever say Command, it's typically going to be Control for PC users. Sometimes it's different, and so you might be confused, and you'll have to go up to the Help Keyboard Shortcuts menu to find out what it is, or you can always ask me in the Q&A tab. And I'm just going to move this layer over to the right. So now we have 3 layers, and this solo option allows us to basically make only one of those layers appear. So if I click solo shape layer 1, only this layer appears. Same if for the kangaroo, it makes all the other layers disappear automatically. And this is beneficial if you have projects where you have dozens or hundreds of layers in a single composition, which actually has happened to me in the past, and you want to really just see one layer, you can use that solo button. The lock button right here locks this layer, so now I can't move it around. You'll see that it does this little highlight when I try to click it, and I can't do anything to this layer. And that's beneficial if you're done with the layer and you don't want to do anything, mess it up, move it around, just click the lock button. To the right, you have this drop down arrow, and so you see that if I click this, it drops down more options. We're going to be covering these things, which are more properties for each layer, in the next lesson. So I'll just skip over that for now. The next is this color option, and this is the color of your layers. So you see that the photo layer was automatically this purple color or this violet, and then the shape layer was this blue. If you want to customize the color of your layers, you can click that color block and then change the color. And this is helpful for organizing your compositions. Say you have, again, a bunch of layers, you want to make sure that you can easily find the right layer. And if you know that, hey, all my red layers are text layers, for example, which this isn't, then it's easier to find that. The source name is the name of your layer. If you click that source layer text up here, it changes to the layer name. And this is how you can actually rename your layers in your timeline to be more organized. So instead of shape layer 1 and shape layer 2, which can get confusing in the long run, what I would do is I would select shape layer 1 and then press the return key on your keyboard. That highlights this title. And now I can call this circle 1 or blue circle. Then if I go to this second layer and I change the color by going up to the fill, changing it to red, clicking on the title, pressing return, and then call it red circle. This is just an easier way to, again, navigate, making you more efficient. And that's pretty much as far as I want to go today in this lesson. I know that this lesson and the past lessons, it's more of that, hey, Phil, we're just going to go around, go through all the menu options. This is boring. But don't worry, the next few lessons are going to get a little bit more interesting. We're going to start animating very soon. We just have to cover the basics right now. So I hope you're learning. I hope you're understanding. If I'm going too fast, please let me know. If I'm going too slow, please let me know, but also be a little patient because there's other learners who are starting from scratch and need a little bit more information. Thanks so much for watching, and in the next lesson, we'll go over more of the layer options that are within each of these layers. Let's talk about our layer properties. To do that, I'm going to delete this red circle, but I'm also going to just leave this blue circle on and our photo. I'm just going to extend this one to the left and extend this one to the right. You'll see that when we created the shape layer that we automatically have some of these options already open, the contents and the ellipse option and the transform menu. Every layer has the transform menu. So if I go into our kangaroo layer and I click this drop down button, you see this transform menu that pops up. To open up this menu, all we have to do is click this little drop down and you'll see all of the transform properties. Anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. These are transform properties for every single After Effects layer. We already looked at scale. This is how you scale up or down a layer. Anchor point, we already kind of saw that with the pan behind tool. This is just the representation of it in pixels based off of where it is on your composition here. So if I take my pan behind tool and then I click on the anchor point and I move it around, you can see that it actually moves the anchor point numbers down in the timeline. Back with my selection tool, if I move this photo around my composition, now you can see that the position is also changing. We can also change these things just by clicking and dragging these numbers here in our timeline, or by clicking the number and actually putting in the exact number that we want. So if we want this to be at 100% scale, we can put in 100%. If we want it to be at 25%, 25%. You'll see two percentages for the scale, and that's the width and the height percentage. And these are typically locked, which you can see with this little link icon, which is the constrained proportions option. If I want to be able to edit the scale of the width and height individually, I can click on that to unlock it. And now I can stretch this photo with the different scale for width and height. So you can see this is also scaling from the anchor point. So it's scaling from this point. And you'll also notice that I can go negative. And so when I go negative, it actually flips the image. If you want it to flip exactly from the center, an easy way to put the anchor point in the exact center is to hold the Command and Shift buttons down. And you can see now, as I drag the pan behind tool around, you see these crosshairs pop open, and this helps you, and it kind of locks the anchor point to the center horizontal and the vertical center lines. If we want it to be in the center, we can drag it and it snaps it to the center. Now you can see if we flip the scale, it flips exactly from the center of the image, which makes it a little bit easier. We have rotation, which we also saw before with the rotation tool. If we rotate, that changes that. And then the other thing we didn't see is opacity. So this is the transparency of this layer, also known as opacity. 100% opaque means that it's fully there. None of it is transparent. If we put it down to say 50%, and then we toggle on the transparency of this composition, you'll see that there is some transparency. Say we move this kangaroo above our blue circle, and then we turn on our blue circle again. Now we can see the blue circle behind our kangaroo. That's because we're at 50% opacity for this photo layer. I can turn off the toggle transparency grid, and you can still see that this circle is behind this photo layer. So let's bring that back up to 100%. All of these transform properties have their own keyboard shortcut, and by the end of this course, you will be well aware and fluent in using them. So for anchor point, it's A. For position, it's P. For scale, it's S. For rotation, it's R. And for opacity, can you guess what it is? It's actually not O, which would make so much sense, but it's actually T, which you can think of as transparency. So with any of these layers selected, you can bring up those different properties. And if you want to quickly close down this layer, instead of just clicking this triangle button, which is relatively fast, but I think keyboard shortcuts make everything faster, you can use any of those buttons, for example, S to bring up scale, and then when you press S again, it closes down the scale property, so none of them are open. T again, closes it down. You can also select multiple layers in your timeline by shift clicking them, or by control clicking them, or command clicking on a Mac, and then you could bring up any of the properties together. So scale, T for opacity, A for anchor point, and so on and so forth. So if I drop this down and open it up again for the kangaroo image, we've gone through all of the transform properties. In the shape layer, you'll see that you have your transform properties, but you also have this contents dropdown. This is different for shape layers, and you'll see this with shape layers. You won't see the contents for layers like photos. And here is actually the ellipse, and let me turn off our kangaroo so we can see the ellipse. This is the ellipse shape that we created in this layer. The confusing part is that we can create multiple shapes within this one layer. We're going to be going over shapes in much more depth in the future, but let me just quickly take the ellipse tool with this layer selected. If I click and drag, you can see that I'm creating another circle. It doesn't create a separate layer, it creates another ellipse within the contents of this one shape layer. So if I turn this on and off, it's both of those shapes in one. And underneath this ellipse layer, we have more options. We have the ellipse path, the stroke, the fill, and transform properties. So there's individual transform properties for each shape layer within this shape layer. Confusing, right? And within these transform properties, there's more options for shape layers, such as skew, which skews a shape, or skew access, which changes where it skews from. Confused? I know it is confusing, and you're going to learn these things as we go and as we use them, but just note that while all layers have the basic transform properties, some layers have different properties. For example, the mask layer. So let me delete the blue circle, which deletes both of those circles we created. Actually, let me undo that and show you that you can drop down our contents folder, and then if you want to just delete one of these ellipses, we can select that ellipse and then delete it. If you want to delete the whole layer entirely, just select the layer itself and not the content layer down below and delete. So if I turn on the kangaroo, then we create a mask. Do you remember how we did that? We went up and used the shape tool, such as the rounded rectangle tool or the pen tool. Let me show you the polygon tool because that's a good one to know too. With this layer selected, now I click and I drag and I have this polygon. It starts out as a pentagon with 5 points. Now we have this mask, which is another option underneath this layer. So if I open up the mask tool, we have mask properties, feathers, opacity, expansion, all of these things you can adjust the same way by clicking and dragging to the right or left, or by clicking and inputting a specific number. I think that's a lot to grasp right now. Go ahead and play around with your layers, play around with your timeline, play around with all of these properties for your different layers. And in the next section, we're going to jump right into animating in After Effects. It might sound confusing, but once you know the basics of it, it actually is relatively simple. So get comfortable with everything that we've learned in this section so far, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to this brand new section. We're going to be animating in After Effects. So throughout this course, what I want to try to do is challenge you based off of what we've learned in previous lessons. So sometimes I might ask you to pause the video and do something. A lot of what we're doing in this section and in future sections, we're building completely from scratch. And I want you to get into the mindset of, I can build it from scratch in After Effects. I don't need a template. I don't necessarily need the project files. While we do have project files for some of the projects so that you can see exactly what I'm doing, in this section, we're creating everything from scratch. So what I want you to do right now is to start a new composition and make it 1920 by 1080 pixels and make it 5 seconds long. So go ahead and pause this video, do that, and then I'm going to show you how to do it if you forgot. All right, hopefully you paused the video. To create a new composition, remember we click this Create a New Composition button. We set our settings 1920 by 1080, and then for the duration, I'm just going to choose 5. And I'll call this Animations. Next, what I want you to do is create a perfect square and center it to the composition. So again, we've learned this in the past section, so you can do this on your own. So pause this video, create a perfect square. How about you make it a white square and put it in the very center? It doesn't matter how big or small it is for this example though. So pause and do that. All right, hopefully you paused. So to create a perfect square, choose the rectangle tool from up top. Under fill or next to fill, click the color and select white, so it's going to be white. Now click in your composition and drag while holding the shift button down. And that creates that perfect square, right? To center it, we have our align panels over here on the right hand side. So click horizontal and center alignment for vertical. So now we have our perfect square. Let's talk about animations. To animate in After Effects, we use what are called keyframes. Keyframes is related to the word frames, and you know with video we have frames. We set our composition to 2997 frames per second. So in every second of our video or our composition, there are 29.97 frames. So if you zoom in on our timeline really far, you can see each frame, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Get it? So a keyframe is telling After Effects that at one point in time, we want X, whatever type of property to be this. So for example, let's bring up opacity. Remember how to do that? It's T on your keyboard, or if you drop down your transform properties, you can see it under opacity. I'll just bring up it with T. So our opacity is set at 100%. Let's go to 1 second on the timeline. So let's go all the way here. To set a keyframe, you can click the stopwatch icon, this little stopwatch next to opacity. And you'll notice if I bring down all of the transform properties, and even if I dive into contents, you can see that some of these things have those stopwatch icons. And that's because you can set keyframes for many, many different things in After Effects. Again, clicking T to bring up opacity, click the opacity stopwatch, and that creates a keyframe. You'll notice that on our timeline right at 1 second, this little diamond appears. Let me move my indicator over to the right. You see that little diamond? That's a keyframe, and that's telling After Effects that at 1 second, we want this square layer to be 100% opacity. Let's go back to 0 frames or 0 seconds. If we click on our opacity and say we choose set it to 0, press return to lock that in place, what happens is we're telling After Effects that at 0 frames, we want the opacity to be 0%. So what happens between 0 and 1 seconds? There's this animation or this transition from 0 to 100. So if I scrub through this, you can see that it creates this fade on effect. That's what opacity can be used for fading on objects or layers. I can move around these keyframes, so I can click them, I can move them around. So if I want a longer fade for it to go 2 seconds, we can move the distance between the two keyframes from 0 to 2 seconds. And now our fade is longer. See that? Or if I want it a lot shorter, we can make it half a second, like so. I can delete keyframes, so I can just select one and delete, or let me undo that, Command Z, and select both and delete. One thing you'll notice, let me undo that. Let's go back to where we had just our one keyframe at 1 second. You'll notice that as soon as I changed the opacity to 0, that a keyframe was automatically set. I didn't have to click the stopwatch to do anything. In fact, if I set our opacity to something different than the 100%, and then I click the stopwatch, what happens is it deletes all the keyframes. Or if we go back again, and our opacity is at 100%, and I click this now, it again deletes everything that we've done so far. So to create a new keyframe, once you've set one keyframe on any individual layer, all you have to do is change the value of that property. So if I drag this down to 0, that is set. Now say we want this to fade on and then fade off. Let's go to 2 seconds. We can set this to 0. And now we have our object fade on to 100%, and then fade off to 0%. How do we get this to fade on and then pause at 100% and then fade off to 0%? Well, we can either go in between these second and third keyframes and either change the opacity to 100%, or I can copy and paste keyframes. So I can select this keyframe, copy it on a Mac, that's Command C. On a PC, it would be Control C, and then paste it, Command V. Now, between these two keyframes, nothing happens. It just stays at 100%. That's the basis of most things we're going to be doing in After Effects. In the next lesson, we're going to take it a step further and start animating other properties. And there are some key things that you'll need to know, especially when animating things like position. That's coming up next, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Let's move on to some other properties. So to get rid of all of these keyframes, remember we just click the stopwatch again. But once we do that, it actually stays at the value where our timeline indicator is, basically. So if I click this there, it's going to stay at 0%. So I'm going to move that back up to 100%. So let's bring down all of our transform properties. Let me just make this a little bit bigger, fit up to 100%. All right, so now you know how to set keyframes. So it's rather simple to create a position animation. So say we want our square to end up here. Let me take my selection tool. We'll set a keyframe for our position. So decide what time you want it to end at this position. So we'll do 1 second and set a keyframe for position there. Maybe we want it to pop up from beneath this composition itself. So I went back to 0 seconds and I'm going to drag this down. And you'll see as I start dragging, because I have a position keyframe, we get this sort of line with little dots stretched between the 2 points. You'll also notice that as I drag down, it's kind of hard to make it precisely going perfectly vertically up without going from side to side. Well, to lock it in place, press the Shift button. And as I do that now, it's kind of locked in place like so. And it locks horizontally or vertically. So now if I drag down below our composition, then let go, and then let me bring in my work area so we can see this animation, and then press the space bar, we have this animation of this square popping up. Cool, right? We can actually add multiple animations to the same object, and that's how we get things to be more intricate. So maybe we want it to grow while it's moving up on the screen. So at 1 second, let's set a keyframe for scale at 100% and then go back. And sometimes I like to leave it on. I don't want to go back to 0 seconds because I can't see the square. So I'll just go somewhere right here in the middle where I still see the square. I'll decrease the scale to where I think I want it. And then, because I don't want it to just go like pop up and then all of a sudden grow, I want it to be growing the whole time. I'll just drag this keyframe for scale all the way to the left. And I did that just so that I can see what I'm working with. So let's play through this. So it's growing as it's appearing on the screen. And then let's just add rotation. So let's rotate. So this will be the final resting spot at this rotation. We'll go back again and let's rotate to the left. Now the problem that I see is that our anchor point isn't in the center of this object. So what happens is it rotates from that anchor point, which is a little off center, which actually looks kind of cool. But if we wanted it to be from the center, you're going to have to do a little extra work. We'll take this pan behind tool. So let's move this back to the center. And then what we'll have to do is see where the position starts. So if we'll go down to where the position starts, we have to put our timeline indicator over this keyframe or it's not going to work. And then we take our selection tool and let's move this down. So now it's rotating from the center and it's moving straight up. And remember what I just did, I pressed the space bar to move my composition up or down. You'll notice that outside of our composition that we still see the outline of our square. And this is just a way that After Effects lets us sort of see what's happening outside of our composition when we have a layer selected. When I don't have that layer selected, you see the square, but you don't see the path that it's on. A good rule of thumb, though, is if you want your animation to be from the center of an object, make sure that you set your anchor point first. All right, now we have this pretty cool animation of the square popping up. What if we want to change the rotation? This is just a reminder that if we want to make it rotate even more and we want to change this first one, remember, we can't just go in the middle of these two keyframes and change the rotation. Say we want it from -36 to -94. Because what's happening is now it's going from -79 to -94 and then back to 0. you'll want to go all the way to the first keyframe, and now with our time indicator on the first keyframe, set the rotation to whatever you want it to start at, like 94. Another way you can do that is just by deleting this keyframe and then moving the one that you just set all the way to the left where it started, or really wherever you want. So that has a little bit more of a rotation, and that's how you change keyframe values after the fact. In the next lesson, we're going to be making our animation look better and a little bit more natural. To make animations look better and more natural, there's a couple things we can do in After Effects. One thing I want you to do is wave your hand in front of your face right now. I know it sounds a little silly, but just wave it in front of your eyes. And do you notice anything about the motion of your hand? It's really blurry. That's called motion blur. And it's just natural that things in our natural environment, when they move, the way our brain processes them, there's a little bit of blur. What's different in this animation is that at every single moment, at every single frame, our square is perfectly sharp. And that's not natural when it's supposed to be moving. So you can add motion blur in After Effects, and that's one of these other columns in the timeline. It's this one with these 3 little dots, and if you hover over it, it's called motion blur. And all you have to do is check that button and enable it for our entire timeline. And that's what these buttons up here do. So you see this 3 little dots one, that's enabling motion blur. And so now you'll notice that as soon as I check that on, you get a little bit of blur on the edges of this square. And as I go through and scrub through, you see that little blur, and that's a little bit of motion blur that makes it look a little more natural. If I make this animation even faster, so I bring all of these keyframes into half a second, which I can do by selecting all, by clicking and dragging over, and then selecting one of them and dragging them to the left, and then play through this, you get even more motion blur, because the faster an animation, the more motion blur you get. Off, on. I typically like to add motion blur to most of my animations. The other thing that you can do to make your motion look more natural is playing with the speed. Right now, between these 2 keyframes, this square is moving and rotating and scaling up at the same speed throughout this entire animation. So from this frame to this frame, it's moving at the same speed as from this frame to this frame. But in nature, things ramp up. If you bounce a ball on the floor, it starts off slow and then it'll speed up, and then it'll go slower as it reaches its resting point. If you start running, you don't start running at your top speed, you ramp up. And so to ramp up animations, what we can do is called easy ease in After Effects. Let me just do that with position. So let me press P to bring up position. And now I just have my keyframes here. To add easy ease to a keyframe or to a set of keyframes, select those keyframes, or just for one, right-click the keyframe, go to Keyframe Assistant, and then choose Easy Ease. Or you can just select them and press F9 on your keyboard. So that's what I'll do. Now with that Easy Ease, you get more of a pop to it. It's that speed ramp, but it also has this sort of like pop action that I think looks pretty cool and looks a little bit more natural. If we extend it to 1 second, it'll look a little bit better. But you'll also know that now when I extended the position to 1 second, I didn't extend the scale or rotation to 1 second. So I want to do that. So what I can do to quickly bring up all of the keyframes for this layer is press U on my keyboard. And that brings up all the keyframes. Now I can take my scale and rotation and move it to the right to 1 second. And if I want, I can easy ease these other keyframes. So I can select all of these, press F9, or right click and choose easy ease. Now with that motion, I think it looks a lot more natural, and you can see it kind of slows into that final resting spot. In the next lesson, we'll take it one step further using an advanced technique that I think you'll understand. You just have to dive right into it, and it will help you change up the speed ramp of your easy ease.